We've had quite a diverse number of sessions today. When I was thinking about them, I found that there is one thing that is behind it and that seems to be in common. And this is always the question about concepts. It looks that without language, it's very difficult for us to develop concepts. But as human beings, we can also have higher level concepts, as has been shown by Joseph. And I was even more astonished when I heard Rafi. There is concepts in the pre-verbal state. And now in the end, we have a presentation that questions even one of our most basic concepts, the concept of self. So maybe this is something that we could discuss for a start.
I might start with saying a bit about animal concepts, just from a biological point of view. I think we have lots of evidence that non-linguistic species have clear concepts, form categories, can learn rules, have memories, etc. I think language supercharges that, and it allows us to share our concepts, but I don't think it changes, I don't think it negates the fact that that the basic conceptual apparatus we have is shared with other species.
Yeah, I also agree that it's not necessarily the basic notion of concept is definitely shared. I think one point that is interesting to note is the hierarchy of concepts, because we usually think about concept as very abstract, but I think what we find in the visual system that you can have concept in the sense of invariances. In other words, you might have selectivity to a particular entity regardless of some manipulations that you do on the input, on the optical input, and you can call it a concept. For example, even some, let's say, line that you are able to recognize it at different locations is already to some extent a concept of a line. So I think we should expand the notion of concepts to a hierarchy where at growing levels we become more and more and more invariant. In other words, we care less about the sort of the physical entities and we are more abstracting into a more abstract level. And maybe there is where humans have a higher stages in the ladder and receive even a higher abstraction of concept.
Well, here's my 2 cents. And it goes like this. First of all, it's really important to clarify what people mean when they talk about language. Part of the problem is that everybody, I can tell you as somebody who's been living through this troubled life, one is everybody has a theory of language. So everybody thinks they know much better than you, and when you tell them something, it's complete disbelief. Like there's no, I'm just complaining a little bit because complainer is my middle name, but the thing is, there's no notion of expertise when it comes to language because everybody knows about it. So this is one thing. And people obviously have very different conceptions of what language is. So my 2 cents in this respect is that the way linguists, at least formal linguists, see language is the focus on compositional rules. It's not the words themselves or the concepts that words denote or some such thing. Rather, it's the formal rules that put things together. So, things rules that are supposed to solve puzzles such as olive oil is an oil made of olives, but baby oil doesn't analyze in the same way, okay? Things of that kind. So it's important to remember where you are when you talk about language. And my hunch is that for the most part, the discussion thus far has been on something that's not what I would call language. This is point number 1. Point number, and I'm not saying it in a critical way, it's just like it's a different domain, the domain of concepts. The second point is highly speculative. When I was beginning to look at the anterior insula, I went to the literature to see what's going on in the literature in this respect. And it turns out that bilateral activations in both insulas, both right and left, different from what we get, are claimed to be related to the concept of self. So there's a whole literature. There's an anatomist named Bud Craig who's mostly involved in this kind of stuff. There's actually like a small cottage industry of experiments that do something of the kind of how do we perceive ourselves. I don't quite understand how to formalize it, and let alone translate it into an experiment, but at least there are claims that both anterior insulas, in a manner that connects to the anterior cingulate, are related to that. I hope it's not related to negation, that's for sure, you know, unless you have a terribly negative view of yourself. I hope it's not related to negation, but at least it's claimed that there are some activations which are related to, like, self-perception.
I want to say just one small cautionary note about linking all of this to animals. And this is related also to something that has been displayed here, this shark figure from the first day. I think it was Christopher Walsh who showed it. Animals, non-human animals, feel their world in a way that's very, very different from humans. Okay, and this is true also not only for sharks and humans, but also for other mammals and humans. And so the concept that they form, in the sense that Rafi just mentioned, these invariant things, are probably different than the ones that we use. And the way that they would reason about the world would probably be also different. So when we fail to teach animals or to get animals to behave in ways that we expect humans to behave, that doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot do a very abstract type of reasoning. So this is just a cautionary note. I mean, it may be that they can do very abstract reasoning about things we don't have any concept about. So when we talk about different species, I think we should consider them as aliens. Okay? We don't know what it is to be inside the head of a rat. And our failures to achieve all kinds of things in all kinds of behavioral effects in animal studies should be taken with that grain of salt.
It's kind of tangentially related, which is that how did we get into the paranoia work? So it shows that people form beliefs and inferences in virtual reality, kind of like they do in reality, whereby we were talking with a clinical psychology professor and pointed out that when people are in virtual reality, and they will pick up on chance events and make whole inferences about that in relation to themselves. So for example, I remember one person saying, whenever I looked at that virtual character, she looked away from me, she doesn't like me. Whenever I looked at this one, he smiled, he likes me. But these were just random chance events. And that's what sparked off the whole work on paranoia, when we realized that people do make these inferences.
I mean, following the fascinating talk that Mel gave, I think I suddenly realized that basically we are in the same profession. I mean, I spent a lifetime dealing with illusion, visual illusion. What does it mean? It's basically getting the insight that this very, very strong intuition that we have, that we see the world as it is. I mean, these are philosophical issues, of course, but actually in the lab, to realize again and again that our concept of the world is actually our own invention, and we can change it depending on the condition and so forth. And now I see the parallel, the immediate parallel with the concept of the self. We feel it so strongly, it's so obvious who we are, and you show that it's just like an illusion, like a face illusion or other Gestalt illusion. You can apply it inside the same way as you can apply it outside. And I think the nice thing about it is maybe it's the same principle, neurological. So one we learn from vision, we might be able to apply it to self-recognition and self-awareness.
I want you to do a visual reality where I can fly like an eagle.
The only trouble is you'll get sick.
Let's open the door for the public.
Okay, I wanted to ask actually a question to all of you regarding what we were talking from faces to places and cognitive event and memory recall and even illusion of walking and maybe up to the cognitive improvement with Einstein. If we can take it, and maybe it's to the future, but that's what makes us human regarding aging, and especially healthy aging. And it feels like, you know, each of you we can take something and maybe improve or implement towards this venture, and maybe for all of us.
From my point of view, can I answer in 5 years? Because we've just started a new ERC project, which has a big component of this in it, to look at what happens, what is following the work of Ellen Langer, when you take people and you put them back in their life 30 or 40 years ago, and apparently you get all kinds of cognitive and physical improvements. We want to see if this also happens when we do it in virtual reality. But I don't know the answer.
You know, whenever you are doing basic science, you always hope that maybe there will be some benefit. And I think the stuff I was talking about this ability of the brain to excite tissue in order to enhance recollection might one day, of course, we are talking about very fantastionary kind of thing, imaginative thing, but maybe one day we'll be able to manipulate the excitability of tissue and by that enhance people declining ability to recall and remember things. I know it's a far-fetched idea now, but at least the beginning is in this direction.
So let me give you some good news, okay, about aging. I mean, there was one slide that fell off my presentation because I'm terrible with technology, and that slide had to do with the study that's related to what I showed about negation with aging, that compared age groups across the lifespan. And one thing that you see, and I think you see it in many studies of syntax and formal semantics, is that there is no change in the healthy aging. There's no change across the lifespan. I mean, you get slower, but that's not news. That's not interesting. I mean, everybody knows that. But there's no selective change in the way you use syntax or the way you use semantics. There is one change that's quite telling, which is it's a long story, but basically in the way you take the semantic representation of a sentence and verify it against a scenario. So that has something to do with the way you use verification strategies, but they seem to be outside of the realm of language. They piggyback on linguistic representations, but they're outside of the realm of these. But again, the good news is that for all that I've seen with respect to aging in those combinatorial systems, they remain quite stable across the lifespan in the healthy populations. If you're sick, then you're sick.
So, there's more questions.
Yes, I wonder, were there any kind of virtual reality experiments done on animals? In theory, you can do it on a dog or a visual or on a corvid. If you do, and you have this, and I would expect that you would have results similar to those in humans. First of all, it would show some kind of continuity in this, along this axis. But also it would allow us to maybe compare different species and also to get some insight into what it is like to be a crow.
Well, I have a PhD student, Chinook Oh, who's been, that was basically his PhD project to try and do not full virtual reality of the sort that Mel is talking about. We just don't have the technology for that. I think it would be possible. I'm not sure who's going to fund it, but you know, in principle, it would be possible to do virtual reality for birds. What we have done is put them in what we call immersive reality, where essentially rather than just having a screen in front of them and they're pushing on bars, we create an environment with screens all around them where they have other marmosets. This has mainly been done with monkeys, where they have other marmosets moving together with them. We were very excited about this because we thought it might make the monkeys sort of happier and feel like they were with their group. It didn't really work. So I think in principle, it's a great idea. In practice, we have a long way to go. I mean, if you think about the money that is behind the kind of work that Mel is showing us, we're talking billions of investment over decades. And I just don't know who's going to fund that for my birds or for my dog. I would love to have a virtual reality of me as an animal and see what it feels like for me to be a dog or a bird or a shark. But I don't think that's answering the question that we want to know the other way.
Well, I know that in Tübingen they did some work with virtual reality for rats, and it took them a long time to get it right before they had to kind of match the rat visual system, and then the rats started behaving as they would expect. And the only thing we've ever done in relation to this is that we put humans and rats together in the same virtual reality at the same scale. So what we did is we trapped the rat in a cage and we had a robot in the cage. And as the real person in virtual reality moved, the robot moved in the rat cage. So the rat was kind of interacting with the robot, which was rat-sized. And the human, as the rat moved, we tracked the rat. So the human was interacting with a virtual human, was actually really the rat. So that the human was interacting with the rat at a human scale, and the rat was interacting with the human at the rat scale. And many people who work in this area thought it was a really good idea to kind of get into how it would be to be, from a human perspective, to be living in a rat colony or whatever they're called, but no one so far has taken it further.
This is crazy stuff.
I have a question for the speakers who talked about language. So it was very beautiful examples that you presented that illustrate how complicated the syntax is of a sentence and how it takes a lot of training to really understand it. But on the other hand, when we speak, I think in real life, we usually don't pay much attention to the syntax. And I read some papers that even if we pay attention, we immediately forget, almost immediately forget the syntactic structure of a sentence, exactly the words that were used. We mostly remember the meaning that was communicated. So in this respect, the language is nothing more than just a way for us to communicate meanings through it to each other. And I'm just wondering if there is a way of studying the language that would kind of separate these two aspects of it, like exactly the structure, syntactic structure that is very complicated and hard to study, I understand, but and the language as a carrier for ideas and thoughts and meanings that we communicate to each other, that I think is also a very interesting aspect. How would you really kind of separate these two things and study it and then see how they relate to each other?
I'll start just because I have the microphone in my hand, but I think what Josef showed us is how to do that, how to start separating language and logic, and I think it's not trivial, but I think that's a step in the right direction. But just to go back to what you said about the automaticity of syntax, it's absolutely right, but that's no different from vision. We don't, when we process a visual scene, I look around, I see people, I see space, I don't see all the little lines and blobs and all the stuff that we know from 50 years of research that our visual system is processing. And I think that illustrates the fact that language is a part of our it's just like vision or motion. A lot of this stuff is automatic, and the fact that we don't know that we're constructing these complex sentences, we just are trying to get the meaning across, is precisely what we would expect if language was like vision. And that was one of the big inspirations for people like Chomsky or Fodor to say, yeah, language is part of our biology. It's not just learned the way we learn how to, whatever, drive a car or do some arbitrary thing. It's very different in kind. But again, I think Josef is doing what you said. So
well, in a way, I wish I was doing what you said, because the problem, I think, is exactly the opposite, or at least in part, the opposite of what you said, namely, the meanings that we have in mind are so incredibly complex, and the sentences that express them are actually simple. So it's like, if I understood you correctly, this is the opposite of what you said. Linguists have this annoying habit of giving examples. So let me be annoying, and I'll give you an example. And think about a sentence like, John is taller than Bill. It's an extremely simple sentence, you would think. All it has is what? John is taller than Bill. 5 words, okay? When you try to translate it into a meaning, it turns out that what you actually mean is the following. There is some degree on some scale such that John is above this degree and Bill is below this degree, okay? This is when you end up formalizing it. This is roughly what you end up saying. And as it turns out, these degrees have a relation between them. So this shows you that, in fact, there's something, at least in some respect, there's something nice about our ability to package complex ideas into simple syntax. Okay, now I don't know, I stopped having intuitions about about meanings and things like that many years ago. But it's not so clear that your intuition is about the simplicity of ideas versus the complexity of our ways to express them. It's not as if it's like something that I would accept immediately.
So, one more last question. Okay, thanks. Last question retracted. So, thanks very much to all the speakers. That was a wonderful session.